What if I told you that a narrow strip of water, so narrow that in some places ships travel through lanes only a few miles wide, has the power to shut down economies, trigger inflation, spark wars, crash stock markets, and send fuel prices soaring across the entire planet? What if tomorrow morning this waterway suddenly closed? Within hours, oil prices would explode. Within days, airlines would slash flights. Within weeks, factories would slow production. Governments would release emergency oil reserves, stock markets would panic, and millions of people from London to Tokyo, from New York to Mumbai, would feel the consequences. This is not a hypothetical fantasy. Military strategists, economists, energy experts, and world leaders think about this scenario every single day. Because one of the most important locations on Earth is not a giant city, not a famous capital, not a financial center. It is a narrow maritime corridor known as the Strait of Hormuz, a place through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply travels and approximately 1/4 of global seaborne oil trade passes every year. This tiny passage connects the oil-rich Persian Gulf to the rest of the world. Without it, modern civilization would face one of the greatest economic shocks in history. But how did this small waterway become so important? Why does so much oil pass through it? What would happen if it closed tomorrow? And could the world survive without it? This is the story of the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz sits between the countries of Iran and Oman. It serves as the only maritime gateway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. Every major Gulf oil producer depends on this route. Oil from Saudi Arabia, oil from Iraq, oil from Kuwait, oil from the United Arab Emirates, oil from Qatar, and even oil from Iran itself. All of it moves toward global markets through this strategic chokepoint. Imagine a giant funnel. The Persian Gulf is the wide end. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow neck. Everything must pass through that neck before reaching the world. That simple geography has made this waterway one of the most valuable strategic locations on Earth. Long before oil transformed the Middle East, the Strait of Hormuz was already a crucial trade route. For thousands of years, merchants sailed through these waters carrying spices, silk, pearls, textiles, and precious goods. Ancient Persian empires recognized its value. Arab traders recognized its value. European colonial powers recognized its value. Control of maritime trade meant wealth, and control of Hormuz meant influence. In the early 1500s, the Portuguese arrived. They seized strategic positions and attempted to dominate trade throughout the region. For over a century, Portugal controlled maritime routes in the Gulf. Later came British influence. As the British Empire expanded, securing sea lanes became a strategic necessity. The importance of Hormuz continued to grow. Then everything changed. Oil was discovered. The 20th century transformed the strait from a regional trade route into a global economic lifeline. As oil production exploded across the Persian Gulf, Hormuz became the world's most important energy corridor. Today, its significance exceeds anything ancient traders could have imagined. This is where the story becomes astonishing. In 2025, approximately 23 million barrels of oil per day moved through the Strait of Hormuz. That equals roughly 20 to 22% of global oil consumption. Think about that. 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil consumed on Earth depends on this narrow passage. Nearly 34% of global crude oil trade also passed through the strait in 2025. To understand the scale, 23 million barrels per day equals over 8 billion barrels annually. If oil averaged around $70 per barrel, the annual value would exceed $560 billion. If oil averaged $80 per barrel, the value would approach $650 billion. At $100 per barrel, the figure would exceed $800 billion. In other words, hundreds of billions of dollars in energy trade move through Hormuz every year. Few places on Earth handle so much economic value. Many people assume the United States is the biggest customer. Not anymore. Asia depends on Hormuz far more heavily. Approximately 89% of crude oil moving through the strait is destined for Asian markets. The largest buyers include China, India, Japan, South Korea. Together, they account for most Hormuz oil shipments. These countries rely on imported energy to power factories, transportation systems, electrical grids, and entire economies. Without steady oil supplies, economic growth slows dramatically. Hormuz is therefore not simply a regional waterway. It is an artery feeding the world's largest manufacturing economies. Many people ask, why can't ships just go somewhere else? Because there is no true replacement. The geography of the Persian Gulf creates a natural bottleneck. Most Gulf oil exports have only one practical route to global markets. Some pipelines exist. Saudi Arabia has pipelines. The UAE has pipelines. but their combined spare capacity can only reroute a fraction of the oil normally flowing through Hormuz. The world simply does not have enough alternative infrastructure. That is why Hormuz remains indispensable. The Strait of Hormuz acts as a stabilizer for the global energy system. Every day, massive oil tankers move energy from regions with abundant supply to regions with massive demand. Without this flow, supply decreases, demand remains high, prices rise, shortages emerge, economic activity slows. Because Hormuz functions normally most of the time, billions of people enjoy relatively stable access to energy. Every airplane flight, every shipping container, every delivery truck, every factory machine, every power plant, all benefit indirectly from the uninterrupted operation of Hormuz. This is why governments invest enormous resources into protecting the route. Military planners use a term called chokepoint. A chokepoint is a narrow route where traffic can be controlled, disrupted, or blocked. The Strait of Hormuz is perhaps the most important energy choke point on Earth. A small disruption can produce massive consequences. That is why naval forces constantly patrol nearby waters. That is why intelligence agencies monitor the region. That is why energy markets react instantly whenever tensions rise. The world understands a simple reality. A threat to Hormuz is a threat to global energy security. Now let's examine the nightmare scenario. Imagine the strait suddenly closes. Day 1. Oil markets panic. Traders begin buying futures contracts. Prices surge. Shipping companies halt voyages. Insurance premiums explode. Day 2. Governments hold emergency meetings. Military forces move into position. Financial markets become volatile. Day 3. Airlines begin calculating fuel shortages. Manufacturers review supply chains. Fuel distributors start rationing inventory. By the end of the first week, global markets could face severe turbulence. Even a short closure would likely push oil prices sharply higher. Now imagine something worse. Not days, months. The consequences become historic. Oil exports collapse. Energy shortages spread. Transportation costs surge. Inflation accelerates. Governments release strategic reserves. Economic growth slows. Recession risks increase. The shock would resemble multiple energy crises happening simultaneously. Recent analyses suggest prolonged disruptions could remove roughly 1/5 of global oil supply from normal markets. That level of disruption would affect every country. Even nations that import little Gulf oil would experience higher prices because oil is traded globally. The financial consequences would be enormous. Stock markets generally dislike uncertainty. A Hormuz closure creates uncertainty everywhere. Investors would fear higher inflation, lower corporate profits, slower economic growth, recession risks. Banks would reassess risk. Companies would delay investments. Consumer confidence would fall. The ripple effects could spread across every major financial center. Modern economies run on affordable energy. When energy becomes expensive, everything becomes expensive. Food transportation costs rise. Manufacturing costs rise. Shipping costs rise. Electricity costs rise. Consumer prices rise. The result is inflation. Families pay more. Businesses earn less. Governments face greater pressure. Economic growth weakens. The social consequences are often overlooked. Higher fuel prices affect ordinary people immediately. Commuting becomes more expensive. Food prices increase. Travel becomes less affordable. Household budgets shrink. In poorer nations, the effects can be devastating. Energy shortages can affect healthcare, transportation, and public services. What begins as a shipping disruption can eventually affect millions of lives. Energy crises often become political crises. Governments face pressure from citizens. Opposition parties criticize leaders. International tensions increase. Countries compete for available energy supplies. Diplomatic relationships change. Political stability can weaken. History repeatedly shows that energy shortages often reshape global politics. Strategically, Hormuz influences military planning worldwide. Nations recognize that energy security equals national security. As a result, navies patrol the region. Alliances strengthen. Defense spending increases. Military exercises focus on maritime security. Hormuz is not merely an economic asset. It is a strategic asset. Whoever influences Hormuz influences global energy flows. For Gulf nations, Hormuz is even more critical. Many economies depend heavily on oil exports, government budgets, infrastructure projects, social programs, economic development, all rely on energy revenues. A prolonged closure would directly affect regional prosperity. The short answer is no, not completely. Alternative pipelines help, strategic reserves help, increased production elsewhere helps, renewable energy helps. But none can immediately replace the enormous volume moving through Hormuz. That is why the world remains deeply dependent on this single waterway. The future will likely bring major changes. Renewable energy is expanding. Electric vehicles are growing. Countries are diversifying energy supplies. Yet oil remains central to global transportation, manufacturing, aviation, shipping, and industry. For decades to come, Hormuz will likely remain one of the world's most important strategic locations. The Strait of Hormuz is proof that geography can shape history. A narrow waterway between Iran and Oman has become one of the most important economic arteries on Earth. Every year, billions of barrels of oil worth hundreds of billions of dollars pass through it. It powers industries, supports economies, influences politics, shapes military strategy, affects financial markets, and touches the daily lives of billions of people. If Hormuz remains open, the global economy benefits from stability. If Hormuz closes, even temporarily, the consequences can ripple across continents. Financially, it affects markets. Economically, it affects growth. Strategically, it affects security. Politically, it affects governments. Socially, it affects ordinary families. Regionally, it affects the entire Middle East. In many ways, the modern world depends on a narrow channel of water that most people will never see, and that is what makes the Strait of Hormuz one of the most powerful places on Earth.